Hello, good morning. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And welcome to this webinar in which we will analyze violence against journalists in Mexico. We believe this is a very important topic. We believe it's an important that we have to analyze and sort it out ways to solve it. It's been way too long. It's been way too costly for lives and for Mexican democracy. This is not only about the freedom of the press, but I will say it's about democracy. Without journalism in Mexico, we will not have a full democracy. I believe this is a key issue for Mexico's still young and fragile democracy. So I want to thank Cecilia Farfan from our team. She coordinates all security programs at the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies to help us put this together, and also our senior fellow on human rights, Michael Lettieri. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Cecilia. Let me give you the floor, Cecilia and Michael, so you can introduce our panelists and you will moderate the sessions. So Ceci, why don't you go ahead and tell us about why this webinar, and you, Michael, and then introduce formally our panelists. I believe we have a wonderful panel. Let me say that the Justice on Mexico program for the University of San Diego is having another webinar on this same topic at 11 o'clock Pacific time. That is in 2 hours from now. I believe it's very important to have different takes, different views on this. So I appreciate that we've been coordinating our efforts, and so you can also, if you don't have enough information and analysis here, join again that webinar at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Cecilia, yours is the floor.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. As you mentioned, I think this is an imperative conversation for us to have, especially at the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies, where we have a program focused on understanding violence in Mexico. And for a lot of researchers like myself, like Michael, who work on these issues, our work truly would be impossible without the work done by journalists in Mexico. So we see them as colleagues who are in a different profession, but nonetheless colleagues who we work very close with. Additionally, at the Mexico Violence Research Project, it was born on the idea of introducing nuance to discussions about violence in Mexico. And I think a lot of the violence against journalists has been framed as related exclusively to the drug war. And so we thought it was really important to have this dialogue today with those who experience this violence, unfortunately, firsthand, and really hear from them and what are the challenges that they have. And especially in light of recent events in Tijuana and where we are located, it was paramount for us to host this conversation. Of course, we have a stellar panel. They are very accomplished. They are award-winning journalists, so I won't read their full bios. Today, I will just give you a short description of who they are so we can have more time for a conversation. So let me introduce Jan Albert Hudson, who is the Mexico representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists. He has worked as a freelance journalist in Mexico City since 2009 for publications in the Netherlands, Belgium, the U.S., Canada, and the United Kingdom, writing on subjects such as press freedom, politics, organized crime, human rights, and environmental issues. Wendy Fry is an experienced investigative journalist who covers politics, government, and education. She's a senior reporter at the San Diego Union-Tribune, where she covers and reports on violence and politics in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. Alejandra Ibarra is the creator and lead of Defensores de la Democracia, an organization that preserves the work of journalists killed in Mexico through the first living archive of its kind, and host of the podcast documentary Voces Silenciadas. Jorge Nieto is an award-winning freelance video journalist, fixer and film producer and camera operator. He manages a team in Mexico where his team covers stories related to Mexico and the USA, particularly topical to the border region. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'll give the floor to Michael.
Thank you, Cecilia. So, as everyone has said, and I will not repeat it, this is a crucial issue. There have been 6 attacks on journalists and 4 journalists murdered in the first 6 weeks of this year. Our neighbors in Tijuana experienced the murders of Margarito Martinez and Lourdes Maldonado, killed within days of each other in January. they became part of a rather grim tally. Some 47 journalists killed under the administration of Enrique Peña Nieto, 29 under the current administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The numbers don't tell the whole story, and that's why we're here to have this conversation. Mexico is and has been as dangerous as a war zone, an active war zone for journalists. And we tend to think that journalists are killed because they are reporting on crime and it is criminals who are attacking them. And that's not always the case. We know that a lot of the danger comes from state actors. We know that it's exacerbated by poor labor conditions. And we know that impunity fuels the violence, facilitates it, but it also doesn't necessarily give us an explanatory mechanism for why it happens. And it certainly doesn't give us a full path forward. So I think part of the conversation we need to have is how we understand violence against journalists as part of this continuum of political violence. As Rafael said, it's incredibly pernicious to democracy. But when we don't recognize that, we run the risk of isolating violence against journalists in its own conversation. And I think that's dangerous. So to begin, I'd like to turn the floor to Wendy, who I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about what has happened in Tijuana recently with the two murders and the general context of the situation.
Sure. So you gave a really good recap there. In just the first month in January 2022, there were multiple attacks and multiple shootings. And here locally with our colleagues in Tijuana, 2 of our colleagues were murdered and shot right in front of their homes. Margarito Martinez, a longtime crime photojournalist who many international outlets had worked with before, was shot right in front of his house, and his daughter was the one who heard the shooting and discovered his body. And so these are brutal, brutal killings, violence at its peak. And in the midst of all that, there have been continual threats coming in against the journalists who are going to the scenes to cover these crime scenes. So even while, the violence is heightened and there's this heightened sense of, okay, we need to protect these journalists, at the same time, they're facing threats while on the job from Facebook commenters, from people who are streaming live Facebook. Margarito was in the process of enrolling in the state mechanism to protect journalists and human rights defenders, and Lourdes Maldonado was already in that mechanism. And so we're seeing a lot of questions about why that system does not function the way that it's intended to function. And all this also, I guess, is happening in the context of this rising violence that we've seen over the past decade or so in Tijuana, in Mexico, that's a result sort of the fracturing, the splintering of the organized crime into smaller and smaller criminal organizations that are less in control. And finally, I'll just say, at the same time, our colleagues are all mourning. Everyone had to sort of get it together and do the reports for the first murder, and then had hardly really recovered or even processed that loss. And then the second one hit. And so our colleagues are in a process of mourning and coming to grips with what they face.
Thank you, Wendy. Jorge, as someone who's covered Tijuana for a long time, do you have a sense that things have changed? Is there a new dynamic in Tijuana that might be contributing to this violence?
Well, Tijuana is a very dynamic city in all the aspects, economical, cultural, political side of Tijuana, and the violence as well. The violence is moving constantly. I see the transformation from the years 2007, 2009, when we used to see these big convoys and the trucks and SUVs riding along in Zona del Rio with the guns, expose the guns, and the big mass shooting. From that to change the methods to start to use small cars, not the big convoys, just single man, a single hitman going to commit the assassination of someone else. We see as a journalist the chain of the strategy on the groups. And always the journalists were being facing the risk being covering that kind of issues, and we know that, and we assume that. And now the situation, I guess, and I have to point, we've been hearing a lot of information related with the murders of the journalists in Mexico recently from different actors, but I guess we don't hear yet this strong statement from the leaders, from the political leaders saying, we're not going to tolerate this. We're going on to the last consequences and prosecute the people who's been doing that. We're not hearing that. I'm part of a network of freelance journalists in all Mexico, and with the recent attack in Cancun, we were like, what the hell with this? What's about? Is one per week, one in every region of the country? So I guess the lack of this statement from the leaders of the country is giving permission or is tolerating this violence against the journalists. Looks like the people in charge don't really care about the violence against the journalists, and that made me feel really worried, because far to find a solution, we're facing more risk, because more people is feeling like, okay, we can do it, and nothing is going to happen.
Thank you, Jorge. Just a reminder to our audience to feel free to write their questions in our Q&A, and we'll also do our best to answer them live and also type them as we move on. Thank you. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you, Jorge and Cecilia. Alejandra, Jorge's connecting this broader pattern of political indifference, perhaps. As someone who's really done in-depth work on violence on journalists and other locations, what connections do you see with the recent violence in Tijuana?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so I think there's several trends that tie together the events that we're seeing nationwide. And some of them, I would highlight that while there's violence and attacks against a wide range of journalists in Mexico, it is oftentimes local journalists who are the attacks of lethal violence. And I think that's very important because as the rest of the violence in the country, the most disproportionately damaged by this kind of violence are the least privileged. And this takes me to the second point, which is a lot of the journalists who suffer the worst kind of violence in Mexico lack support from institutions, from media institutions, from big networks, from big newspapers, and they're oftentimes freelancers like Margarito, or even Lourdes, who had her own show on social media due to the pandemic. And we've seen this across the nation, right? So it's journalists who, for one reason or the other, oftentimes because they do not have editorial independence in their media outlets, decided to found their own media outlets. They either report directly for social media, they have their online newspapers, they create their weeklies, they have their community radios, and there's a lack of protection and a lack of institutional support in all kinds of senses, right? So there's no benefits, there's poor salaries, there's no mental health containment for PTSD and for all the risks that they're taking. And at the end, they're disenfranchised and they're facing all these threats and they're facing all this violence with their own tools, right? With themselves. Yeah, and just like to add, I would also say that, as you were saying at the beginning, even though Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries to be a reporter and only compares to countries that are in war, and that the violence in Mexico is super high, the violence that is suffered by journalists who are murdered is not crossfires. Sometimes there's a misconception about this, especially abroad. It's not that they die because Mexico is so violent that like some lost bullet killed them. They are targeted. And as Wendy was saying, they go to their houses, they go to their homes, and they are specifically sought out to be killed. And this is a very distinct kind of violence. They often do also cover not only crime, but also politics. And a lot of times the politics they cover isn't necessarily their collusion with crime, but it can also be potholes, poor services, accountability to the most basic level, public works, infrastructure, etc. And also this can oftentimes be combined with crime.
Thank you, Alejandra. John Albert, one thing that's come up is this issue of a lack of institutional support. And perhaps the most, I don't want to say mind-boggling, but upsetting lack of institutional support is the fact that the mechanisms that have been created, that have received significant support from the US even, are failing and are really not working. What's your take on that? What can be done? How can we improve that?
Thank you, Michael. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here and for having us speak about this incredibly difficult but important topic. Yeah, I think that after 5 years, where approximately 10 journalists who were in federal protection, a handful of journalists who were under state protection, and a very large number of human rights defenders who were in federal protection have been killed while they were, at least on paper, enjoying state protection, is definitely a sign that the system is failing. And I think we need to distinguish between the federal protection mechanism and the state protection mechanisms. Those are two sort of different things, although the vast majority of state protection mechanisms, like the one in Baja California that had enrolled Lourdes Maldonado, was created in the wake of the murder of Javier Valdez and Miroslava Breach, two reporters in 2017 by presidential decree under then President Enrique Peña Nieto. The state mechanisms, I've been sort of very brief. The vast majority of them, even if they exist, because only about half of all the states in Mexico have a functioning state mechanism, they generally don't work, largely because the state governments in Mexico have shown a distinct sort of disinterest in even creating them or bumping them up to a level that they're functioning. Most of them, like the one in Baja California, they're very small. They don't have their own budget. They're not autonomous. They are operated by a skeleton crew, and they coordinate with other state agencies who generally are sort of resistant against providing a very comprehensive package of security for journalists. And we shouldn't forget that, in many cases, when, according to Article 19, when more than half of all the crimes against journalists in Mexico are actually committed by either municipal or state officials, these state agencies are, in one way or another, coordinating security measures with potentially the aggressors of the journalists who are enrolled in those schemes. So that in itself is sort of a recipe for, they're set up for failure. And the federal mechanism, I want to be fair, there have been instances when the approximately 500 reporters who are currently enrolled in the federal mechanism have received a degree of protection that might have been sufficient in cases of emergencies, but ultimately still 10 people who were enrolled were killed. And if we sort of very briefly analyze why the federal mechanism isn't working the way it should be, it has to do with the fact that it's highly centralized. It's entirely based in Mexico City. Only has about between 35 and 40 people working for them. They have to coordinate with state governments who are very often not willing or able or both to provide the kind of protection that the federal government is asking them, requesting them, or even demanding that they implement. They have a very small budget. The budget for this year, even though the Mexican federal government is sort of claiming it as some kind of victory, is up to 400 million pesos. That's only about $20 million. And that's a very low amount of money. It's even less than the Mexican federal government is spending on baseball, to give an idea of how few resources they actually have at their disposal. proposal. And one of the things that I found very jarring about the federal mechanism is that it actually recruits its personnel from the pool of public officials through the regular process within the federal government in Mexico, meaning that the people who end up working for the federal mechanism are usually people who work from Mexico City. They have limited knowledge of what's going on in the rest of the states in the country. They do not have a specific human rights profile. They usually lack the sort of sensibility to understand why journalists may run risks, why human rights defenders may run risks. And there's a lot of human error, you know, not picking up the phone, not sending the papers in time, not processing everything in time, hearing about threats and not taking them seriously enough. So all of those issues altogether make them an agency that is inadequate at best and doomed to fail at worst.
Thank you. This question of then how do we create change around this issue? I want to turn back to Wendy as someone who is a foreign correspondent effectively. What's the role of foreign correspondents of the international media in both sort of the need for local journalists, the reliance on local journalists, but also how do you tell their stories, right? What's the role of the international community, international media there?
Right, and let me get to that question in just one second. I just want to add to this discussion that we're having that in hopes of change, you know, that there's got to be justice. There's got to be someone held accountable for these killings. I think my editor, Jeff Light, asked me, you know, what percentage of hope do you have that they're going to arrest somebody for killing Margarito, and that person that they actually arrest is going to be the author of that? And I have very, very little hope that that's going to happen. I probably arrest somebody, but whether that person actually was the author of the crime, I highly doubt that somebody's going to be held accountable. And I know we've put the number out there many times, but 90% of these crimes go unprosecuted, without justice, without somebody convicted. And then of the 10%, I guess, that they do find someone responsible, the subsecretary of the Human Rights has said that about half of them are local officials. So that's where there's a reluctance, again, that the police force, the investigative agency, works for officials who are often the authors of the crimes. And I'm not saying that's specific to Margarito's case, but I'm saying that that is what has been the historic background. So the fact that there never are any answers, you never get an answer of why was this journalist killed? Why was this human rights defender killed? We can guess, we think we know, but because nobody gives any answers, that's often, I think, allows this impunity to continue and allows these crimes to keep continuing. But as far as the role of the international media or the media in the United States, you know, I think, and I have been trying to express as much as I can just how brave my colleagues are and just how committed that they are to the democracy of Mexico, and how they, you know, they work for very low pay and they work often for multiple outlets at a time just to you know, make ends meet. They work for several different outlets at a time, so they're working at a hurried pace and they're taking risks with their lives to go out and get those stories. And so I think it's extremely important for the international media, and we already have some, you know, coming into TJ, to understand, you know, not to ask these colleagues to take a risk with their life. And then they're going to go home, you know, they're going to go back home to Northern California where there's no risk whatsoever to their life. But that reporter, that local reporter, is going to stay there. They're going to stay in that community where maybe they've been asked to look, hey, can you get me an interview with a narco? You know, that person is going to be staying in the community after that happens, where the international reporter is going to go home to their safe home. And so I think it's really important for when working with local media, and they're so willing to work with and help and get the story out, because they are so committed to getting the truth out, to getting the facts and the story out. And they're also so committed to telling the truth, no matter what side is trying to sway them, you know. even more so, I think, than our media here in San Diego is. And so I really think that that's something that needs to be expressed. We need to figure out how we can help support the work that they do on a bigger scale, on a more organized scale. We need to figure out how we can support our local journalists in Tijuana and in other places in Mexico, because it's really important not to be exploitative. You know, when you have somebody who's willing to put their life on the line to go get the story.
Yeah,
it's really important.
Let's bring Jorge in here as someone who freelances and fixes. How does that put journalists at risk? I mean, every journalist I've talked to sort of has a story about the time I was a fixer, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's got an anecdote. But I still think it's not necessarily well understood. If you went and you said to a person on the street, you know, hey, my friend is a fixer, I'm not sure people understand that. So how does fixing put journalists at risk, and how can we perhaps change the dynamics there?
I think we're on the way to change that dynamics, because unless we're talking about in different forums about the role of the film producer, the local fixer, who help the big organizations to get or create these amazing stories. And it's important to keep doing these stories, but it's important to get ready to do it, to work with them. So as a fixer, we need to constantly be training, be understanding and reading the reality of the area that we work, because we're going to give we're going to be able to give the right advice to the people. Sometimes the money that you can get working as a fixer is more attractive than the money you can get working for a local a network or local newspaper. And a lot of my colleagues, they decide to run the risk because gonna get a little bit better money, but they stop to think in the future in the consequences. We're trying to change that. We're trying to do more workshop with the new fixers, with the people who are jumping to this industry, to tell them, like, be careful. You need to analyze the risk. You don't have to say yes to everything. Your work is very important. It's the most important to create that story, and you need to be able to put some boundaries in the demands and the requests of the international media. Sometimes a French journalist asked me to go inside of a drug tunnel, and not just a drug tunnel operating. So a drug tunnel not discovered by the authorities. He wants to go inside and see how the drug go from Tijuana to San Diego. And I say, thank you, but no, thank you. I'm not going to do this, because yes, imagine the worst scenario. They can kidnap you because you're an international journalist or you're a good fish for them. But in the other situation, I'm gonna stay here. You're gonna back to Europe. You're gonna be safe, but I'm gonna stay here. If something goes wrong, if your report is not something that they like, they're gonna come against me. But I learned on the way, like yes, you can say no to things. Another side that I want to add to the conversation, I asked to my colleagues in different cities during the protest, I asked to them, in the protest, who joined the protest? I see many reporters, photographers, videographers, but I don't see many owners, many directors, the people who take the decisions and send their reporters to the streets and say and run the risk. They respond, oh yeah, well, we see A, B, C, D, and both of them are ex-journalists or current journalists who create a internet media or a small news project. But I'm referring to the big names, to the big families who run the big companies of communications in Mexico. They don't go, they don't attend. They don't say nothing like, okay, we're gonna create a protocol, a security system for all reporters and all photographers. We're gonna raise their salary so they don't have to work in 7 different places to get a decent income month by month. And I think we need to keep talking about this, because as we say at the beginning of the conversation, it's not just about the drug war. It's not about the big mass shooting between the big group and big cartels. It's these little actions who put the daily report, the daily photographer on risk day by day.
Thank you, Jorge. One of the sort of to follow on that, one of the daily actions that really ranges from both the micro, local to the national is this question of how politicians talk about journalists. So on the one hand, you have AMLO being very dismissive, if not downright offensive, when he talks about journalists. But that's a pattern that repeats on a local level too. Alejandra and John Albert, how do you read that sort of rhetoric? What's the impact of that, both on the local small level and in terms of AMLO?
If it's together with you, John, I'll start. I would say that it's definitely a dangerous rhetoric, in the sense that it doesn't respect and give the importance and the place to journalism that it should have, specifically in a democracy. And that the fact that the president is having this rhetoric from like the biggest office in the country and from his bullet pulpit only makes it possible for other levels of government to replicate this same, not only the same speech and the same rhetoric, but the same sentiment. And in places where there's less accountability and where there's more collusion and where there's less accountability to impunity and where crimes are even more rarely solved, that rhetoric, I believe, can translate into action. And it doesn't necessarily encourage it, but I think that the rhetoric does allow it.
I think there are basically two consequences that I think are relevant when it comes to the president's rhetoric. One of them is that they are definitely a distraction from his government's failings in addressing impunity. Just simply the lack of comprehensive public policies that make the country safer for journalists and human rights defenders, like reforms of the Special Prosecutor's Office, like reforms of the mechanism, etc. But I actually have an anecdote about the second part. Last year, when Azucena Oresti, who is a news anchor for Milenio Televisión, received a death threat, allegedly from El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel, nobody's really been able to verify, but for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that it really did come from him. Even though the president, on the day that she received these threats, said, well, this is unacceptable, so we'll have to investigate it, I could actually see on social media how a number of people who are loyal followers of the president, who believe in his political project and also believe in what he says, were saying, well, she deserved it. She's a right-winger, a conservative, she's corrupt. So basically, it's fine that they receive these death threats. And if you're dealing with a government that still has the support of anywhere between 40 and 60% of the population, and the nature of this support is significantly more intense, fanatical than previous governments, because this is a very highly ideological government with people who really believe in him, who've invested years and years of support in this president, then it's getting more and more difficult for people like us, for our Mexican colleagues, for basically anyone who's dealing with press freedom, to convey the sense of urgency that we need to convey in dealing with the problem of violence against journalists. I think that's where we need to. That's where we get the most detrimental effects of the president's rhetoric.
Thank you. Some of these questions have been informed by questions coming up in the Q&A. I'd like to specifically flag a couple questions we have about protection mechanisms and the history of protection mechanisms. George Holfetter is asking about where do you see the role of institutions designed to protect journalists and freedom of expression, like the CNDH's Programa sobre Agravios a Periodistas, the FIADLE, and the Mecanismo in this dynamic? And this in particular because the CNDH and the FIADLE were established before the increase in anti-press violence. Where do you what do you make of that? And we have a question follow on from Laura Araujo of why the programs are not working. And I think we've touched on some of this, but if you were going to give 3 key points.
We'll talk about
Go ahead.
the mechanism.
No, you probably better.
Oh yeah, thanks, Tony. Yeah, no, I'll keep it very brief. Just want to quickly focus. It's a really, really good and important question, this one. Thank you for that. Just to focus on the CNDH and on the FIADLE, there are 2 recent developments that I find that are concerning to me. And the first one is the fact that the CNDH, even though it was created to be sort of a counterweight, an autonomous counterweight for the Mexican government, it has under the López Obrador administration very rapidly politicized, and it has lost much of its autonomy. And I think that many of the declarations that the CNDH has done, or the lack thereof rather, over the past, say 2 to 3 years, are a sign that it's getting more and more difficult to count on the CNDH as an autonomous organ to support journalists, up to the point where some of my colleagues are actually saying, well, the National Human Rights Commission is no longer a partner. They're no longer an interlocutor in this discussion. And when it comes to the FIADLE, what I also find very deeply concerning about the FIADLE is that they seem to be withdrawing from their role in, for example, the mechanism. The Fiscalía General de la República, the Attorney General's office, is supposed to be one of the strategic partners who is involved in risk evaluation, in the juntas de gobierno, the roundtable discussions where the protective measures are being discussed with the federal mechanism. And there seems to be, under the new head of the Attorney General's office, and as a consequence, also the Special Prosecutor's Office, Alejandro Gertz-Manero, a distinct sort of lack of interest in protection. So I think that all of these institutions, all of these counterweights, as imperfect as they might be, that were created to strengthen the mechanism and strengthen these institutions, it's being eroded under the López Obrador government. And I think that's something that we may want to point out a little bit more forcefully as civil society groups, I think, in the years that follow. Thank you.
I'd like to add, if you allow me, just 30 seconds, a short answer. Imagine how that reality can impact in the small communities of Mexico, in the Guerrero Mountains, in Michoacán. Let's move that from Tijuana, which is a big city, and I have correspondents from most of the main agencies, international journalists coming from California, like Wendy or another colleagues, because we are there. We're a 2 million big city. But what about little towns in Jalisco, in Michoacán, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Veracruz, where the mayors, the politicians, the drug dealers, the narcos, the ejidatarios feel like, if the president is saying that, whatever, let's do it. Let's kill him. Let's kill her. Let's kidnap him. Let's kidnap her. Because there is this lack of interest. There is this impunity of the 90%. We've been repeating this number many, many times recently, 90%. But put it this way, 9 of 10 murders, nothing happened. So the chance, if you're a hitman, the chance to be arrested is 1 of 10. If you put in the balance, okay, I'll make money killing that person, the risk to be arrested, okay, 1 of 10, less than 10%, it's worth it. It's a good business, so why not? So that reality, that impunity, that lack of justice, that rhetoric of that constant rhetoric coming from the governors, from the states, is creating the perfect ambient, the perfect, I don't know what's the right word to say that, but I know if you, and I put in my point, if I put in my point on the table, maybe you have something to add on this, Wendy?
Yeah, I agree with you. It just creates this perfect atmosphere, a perfect storm for this. Yeah, and I would say that a lot of the threats are not taken seriously as well, and that's mind-boggling to me. And you know, with the amount of journalists who have been killed, but still, there's sort of this downplaying of, you know, a threat comes in and the journalist goes to the agency and says, okay, this person on Facebook says he knows where I live, he knows where my family lives. You know, and the agency says, well, you know, how do you feel? Do you really feel like you're in risk or whatever? And so I feel like there's just this lack of taking it seriously with the protection agencies that are in place.
Let me press just a little bit more on this so we can unpack these further for our audience and just bringing in some of the questions. So, you know, in discussing these conditions, we would also like to know what is the difference for, you know, international journalists versus, you know, Mexican journalists. I mean, what is the difference in terms of like the risks that they face? And then let me add to that, Wendy and Alejandra, I mean, I'm very interested in also learning what are the differences as women who cover, you know, topics related to violence and corruption, and what is it that you see also, you know, anything that is exacerbated precisely because of your gender in this profession?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I would say that just to touch upon another question that was in the Q&A section, because I think it's important for the mechanism point of the conversation. I think part of the problem is also how bureaucratic the processes are to get approved protection. And sometimes the proof of the evidence that has to be given to the mechanism falls upon the journalist. So it's not enough that you're working under like hard circumstances and that you're probably freelancing or lack institutional support. You are also charged with a lot of mental health pressure and probably PTSD if you've already been threatened or if you're already being attacked. Then you also have to have all these documents and proof and evidence that you have been threatened and that you do need the help. And all these processes are not only super cumbersome for the journalist, him or herself, but they're also very lengthy. So by the time that the journalism actually does recognize that you probably did have a reason to have fear or you do have a realistic threat, sometimes the implementation of the protection mechanism comes in too late. So just wanted to add that into the conversation. And as for the differences between international and national reporters, I think it replicates also at a national level. I'm not international, but being in Mexico City, I definitely do not feel like I suffer the same risks as my fellow colleagues who cover the topics locally. As Jorge was saying, the level of danger or threat or risk that I undertake in Mexico City versus the level of risk that a reporter undertakes in the mountains in Guerrero has no point of comparison, right? And that has a lot to do with a lot of things, and not to get in too deep, but it does have to do with a level of privilege, and it does have to do with a level of protection that maybe I can have quicker access to John Albert in Mexico City, or to Article 19, or to RSF, and maybe it's not so hard if I have like the protection of an institution for me to go to the mechanism and say like, hey, here's all the evidence because my network supported me. And I also think there's a level of protection that comes with skin tone, to be totally honest, because there is a perception that there's probably going to be more consequences. And that applies both for my skin tone being Mexican, but for international journalists who have the visibility of the probable protection of the Department of State from the US. And as for gender, I will be brief and let Wendy speak more to all of this. But I would say that in Mexican machismo society, it can be kind of a two-sword weapon. So in some cases, it's even worked a little bit in my favor because they don't take me that seriously. And people will say like, oh, you don't have like the profile to be covering these things. Like you are a woman, or they see me young and you're like a girl. So I won't even be considered a threat in that sense, which I think is ironic, but I do think it plays into the role of gender. And I'll give the floor to Wendy.
And I agree with everything Alejandra said. I think I read in Alfredo's, in the Midnight in Mexico book, that there's never been any attack against a U.S. journalist working in Mexico. And I think that is just the privilege that Alejandra was talking about. There's a sense that it would be taken more seriously. And then as far as gender, and that's very important. I feel like that's very unfortunate that the value of life of these journalists that are working so hard every day, I think that it needs to be much more valued internationally and within Mexico. And then as far as gender, I feel like it's the same. You know, I get worried about talking about the machismo in Mexico, because I feel like it's the same on both sides of the border. I feel like I face the same gender bias in the United States as in Mexico. And so I just want to be clear about that, yeah, there's just sort of a more attention paid to the looks rather than the product of the work, which, and as Alejandra said, maybe that plays both sides, just, you know, maybe not as noticed, but I sort of that work is valued less.
Michael and Ceci, could I make a question? Thank you. I believe that we're here. I mean, what really prompted this is that, I mean, the murder of Lourdes Maldonado in Tijuana. And but a lot of people like Andrew Rodman from the Wilson Center and David Schick from here and a few others, they reach out to us and tell us, let's join forces, let's do something. Congratulations for doing this. So Wendy, Alejandra, Jorge, and Jan, what is what in the U.S. universities, what we think tanks on Mexico in the U.S. Or all over the world could do to make sure that we continue this conversation, that we continue to press whoever we need to press, because I do believe that, I mean, this is something that it's terrible, but unfortunately it goes like a roller coaster. It goes up and then we go down. And so how can we keep the pressure? Because this is of the utmost importance, not only for the life of these people, but I would say for Mexico's democracy. And is there anything you think that, I mean, what else the US could do? And if there's any country out in the world that could set the example to Mexico in protecting journalism, so yours is the floor, you're the experts, but I believe that I would love to join forces and try to do something that could be a permanent pressure, basically on the Mexican state, because yes, I mean, we all have to work together, but I believe in the end, the responsible for security is the state, because this is a public good which should be provided by the state. But we know that we have to pressure and be there, because otherwise it will not happen. John?
Thank you, Rafael. I wanted to quickly circle back to your first question about what U.S. universities and colleagues in the U.S. can do. And referring to something that Wendy mentioned that I think is very important. The lack of knowledge that we often have about these cases. Where did the danger come from? Who was involved? Who is responsible? Who dropped the ball in protection? You know, when Alejandra and Defensores de la Democracia created this amazing podcast about the murder of one journalist in Estado de Mexico, all this information came out that nobody really knew about this particular case. And I think that data plays a very important role, because Mexican authorities, their first knee-jerk reaction to a murder like this is to muddle the waters and try to immediately steer the discussion away from the work of journalists. We saw it twice in the past 2 to 3 weeks. First, when municipal police officers in Tijuana told local media, well, you know, Margarita Martinez was murdered because of a fight between neighbors and there was alcohol involved. And that was basically it. They didn't even have any evidence to say so. I'm still at a complete loss as to why they would have even told media this, other than trying to make sure that nobody looks into the authorities' role in that. And when Jesus Ramirez Cuevas, the presidential spokesperson, last week said that our colleague in Michoacan who was murdered, Roberto Toledo, was most definitely not a journalist, even though the same day the editor of Monitor Michoacan had already said explicitly that Roberto Toledo did work not as a journalist, but as a collaborator. Well, at CPJ, we have a separate category for those people called media workers to make sure that their cases aren't left out. I think that universities, with their impressive capacity to gather and interpret data and complement the work of journalists and civil society groups with that, can play a very important role in this, because once it's been conclusively made explicit that authorities may have a role in something, the data is out there, the information is out there, there's nothing the authorities can do to sort of muddle the waters anymore. So I think that's where universities can have an important role. I think that UC San Diego is already doing a great job. I mean, you're already discussing this, you're already investigating this, you're organizing these webinars. But that's where I think the biggest difference can be made. Thank you.
Ale?
Thank you, and thank you for the shout out, Jan, about Voces Silenciadas, our podcast. Yeah, I agree 100% with what you said, Jan, and I think that one of the things that I also think universities can do specifically is, there is a huge importance in pressuring the government and the public officials and the people in charge of protecting the lives of journalists. I also think that there's an important effort to be done in creating conscience and in changing the way we as a society think about the products and the work of local journalists. Because in Defensores de la Democracia, we think that part of the problem is that a lot of people and like a general society, people are tired of this topic. And people oftentimes, when they hear that another Mexican journalist has been killed, they dismiss it and they think like another one, like it's probably for a reason, or yeah, like what's new? So I think that part of what we can do and what universities can do is get to these larger audience, not a specialized audience, not necessarily a government official or a government official in their civilian part of their life, as a part of the society and as a part of the democracy, and help people understand the value of this, as we call them, democracy defenders, who with their everyday life work are contributing to having better and more better informed and more just societies. So yeah, I think that there could be efforts to honor their works, to explain what they did, to explain the context under which they worked, and to really explain in a more detailed way what Jan was saying about like, when did it fail? Who were they offending? Why hasn't it been solved? Who was the MP or like the prosecutor's office in charge of the investigation? Where did it fail? How did it stop? Who was involved? Like going really deep into the investigation. I think that can really be done with the help of universities and specifically with U.S. media as well, who are like in a safer position.
Jorge?
Thank you. Definitely agree with Alejandra and Jan. That was you say, because the universities in another countries and the researcher centers like COLEF in Mexico and another very important in Mexico and other countries lead the public opinion and can help to create public policies. So it's very important the job that you've been doing to give tools and the right information and go deep in the topic like we're doing now. I have in the recent experience of the Journalist College in Mexico, a lot of colleagues from another countries or people that are talking about this murder. The first question most of the time they ask is, oh, because the narcos, oh, El Chapo, right? Because they are involved. So they have this movie and the rest of the world, like everything is related with the big cartels, big drug issues. And we know it's not like that. Sometimes it's a lot more simple. It's a local city council, is a local or the street drug dealer, not the local, like any drug dealer can have a gun and kill a journalist because they feel they are putting, jeopardizing their business. So it's important to tell to the rest of the world it's not just about this. There is too many actors who are creating this bad ambient for the journalists. So yes, what you've been doing is very important, and replicate the voices and talk with the right people because you have access to the right people.
When did you want to weigh in? And then I will give the floor to Michael and Ceci because time is almost over.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. I think I picture a big collaboration of many media companies and many media, international and in Mexico, collaborating together to get to the bottom of these investigations, as Alejandra said. And then also, you know, anything that can be done. So the local journalists in Tijuana formed a foundation that they support each other when they get sick or when they have COVID or when they can't work because, you know, somebody and universities that benefit so much from the work that these local reporters do on the ground day to day might end up being contributors or somehow, you know, helping get the word out about these foundations that journalists are starting to use to support themselves locally. I think those two ideas are great.
Thank you, Michael.
I'd like to make, there are a couple questions about the role of the United States. Before we get to those, I do want to make one comment, sort of, Alejandra has spoken about memory and journalists. And anecdotally, the role of journalism in democracy, I think we say that a lot, right? We talk about journalism is important to democracy. It's important to human rights and broader memory. Journalists are the ones who have documented what's gone on since 2007. And that gets missed. It's important sort of from a human rights perspective, but I'm currently working on a project where we're documenting abuse in Nayarit, basically. And it is mind-blowing to me, of all the reports I've read, official reports, NGO reports, the report we're producing, how reliant we are on really a handful of sources produced by journalists who wrote about Nayarit. We would not be able to tell the story of this horrific corruption and these human rights abuses that occurred were it not for like 4 people who wrote these stories. And so when we don't protect journalists, that's what we're losing. It's, you know, democracy is amorphous, but the ability to say, the ability to produce accountability, that vanishes, and it vanishes remarkably quickly. Which I think is part of one of the reasons why the US should care about this. So to get to the questions that we have, Claire Silke from CRS is asking about, is the US still supporting the protection mechanism? So USAID had provided financial support. There's a question about weapons from the US. What's the role of that? And generally, more broadly, is the US concerned in what can be done there?
I mean, that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Wendy. Why
No,
don't
I'm just saying that's a great question. I mean, 250,000 weapons every year trafficked south. Obviously, that's helping fuel the violence, and anything the United States can do as a policy measure to stop that from happening will be impactful.
I mean, we're almost over. It's 2 minutes to 10, and but why don't each one of you make a final comment, and then we'll give Cecilia the floor at the end. Thank you all for being with us. This is wonderful, and to be continued. I believe that we will talk to you. Hopefully, we could do this 2-3 times a year at least, and we'll talk to other think tanks and universities. This is important. I mean, this is the way we started 2022 in this regard is awful, and we have to make sure that I mean, we will create a partnership with you to try to help this, because this is of the utmost importance. So Jorge, Jan, Alejandra, Wendy, one last idea, and then we'll give to Cecilia the last comment.
Yeah, if I can start just to quickly. I think it's very important to talk as well about the emotional stress of the journalists we're having with all this situation, because it's really hard. I guess we guess we are okay with the violence, but when we cover the death of a partner or death of colleague, it's really confronting. And this situation that happened just with this very short time window between Margarito and Lourdes, that was very stressing for all of us. I just reflect on the body of Margarito still war, and then we have to make room in our hearts to mourn another of our colleagues. And it's not fair for anyone. It's horrible. It's really horrible. Don't have the right to cry your colleagues because you need to run to the next story. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. It's a hard closing statement to follow. But to follow Jorge, I just want to add that part of what we do is precisely try to contribute to that remembering and to that preservation of memory. Sorry, I got mixed with both languages. But yeah, in Defensores de la Democracia, one of the things that we started noticing when we started was that a lot of the journalists who were killed were only known as the victims of crime beyond their immediate communities. So if you're not from Tijuana, you probably only will remember Lourdes and Margarito as people who were murdered. And that's not fair to anyone starting by themselves. It's also not fair to Tijuana, and it's also not fair to the country. So yeah, I would say that let us not remember Lourdes and Margarito because someone killed them, and let us preserve Brebaje, Lourdes' broadcast program. Let us preserve Margarito's freelancing career. And one of the things that could also be done with universities in the US or with people in the US is one of the things that we struggle with in Defensores de la Democracia is that our archive preserves the work of journalists after they have been killed. But to Mike's point, what would happen if we could create an archive of local journalism in Mexico, of all local journalism, that preserves the kind of reporting that oftentimes only local reporters produce, and that one can filter and search and consult and visit and consume, not only when someone is killed, but all the time and before someone is attacked. But yeah, that's my final thoughts.
Jan and Wendy, and we go to Cecilia.
Okay, I just wanted to, piggybacking off what Alejandra said, I remember Margarito as someone who had such a joy about him, even though he was in these very grisly, gross crime scenes all the time. He was always so upbeat and so happy. And that's what I think most people remember about Margarito here locally. And I did not know Lourdes personally, but I know that she always asked questions like very strongly, like she was not going to softball. She did not softball a question ever. Like if she asked you a question, it was coming right at you. And so those are two things I would love people to remember if you're not here from TJ. And also what Rafael said, just that like, I think that the democracy of Mexico is dependent on these journalistic works. Thank you very much for this.
Dan, and then we go to Cecilia.
Thank you. I'll keep it very brief because these were all fantastic statements and I would like to wholeheartedly second them. Yeah, just to finish off, I think accountability starts with truth, and starts with truth about what happened, about who was responsible, but also about who were these people, as Alejandra mentioned. What were they working on? Why were they working on things? What were the daily challenges? So, you know, if our ultimate goal, including the one of this conversation, is to hold people accountable for failures that are costing lives and that are costing, you know, citizens in Mexico their access to information, to be informed citizens and to function as such within their societies, then we need to be as complete and as factual as possible. And I think that, you know, my colleagues here, that, you know, that's their bread and butter, that's their daily work. I think we still have a lot of work to do, but, you know, we have to continue. And, you know, best way to combat all of this misery is by making sure that we know what it is exactly that we're dealing with, the facts and the truth. Thank you.
Ceci.
Thank you, Rafael. Of course, I want to thank also Mike Lettieri for putting this panel together, and of course for you taking the time and joining us and having a very honest conversation about what is happening in Mexico. I just want to also thank our audience for joining us today and just let them know that we will be producing a joint document of key takeaways also from the event that's taking place in a little bit from the Justice in Mexico project or Neighbors in San Diego. So please be in the lookout for that. And we take your recommendations of what a university can do very seriously, and we certainly hope that we can continue to work with you. As I mentioned at the beginning, we couldn't do our research without the work that you do. So we take these very seriously. And so thank you everyone for your time today, and we'll be, continuing this.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.